Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. Once again, virtually meeting through Zoom. I imagine that everybody in our listening audience has now had an opportunity to enjoy the blessing of Zoom. This is one of several Zoom meetings for me today. This is the second of 4. How about you guys? You got any other Zoom meetings lined up for the day?
Not today, but I have a number of others during the week at different points.
Yeah. I was on 2 yesterday. I think one the day before, and then Saturdays they will be for the next month and a half. So, and then Wednesdays. So yeah, there's a lot of Zoom. I'm doing a lot of Zooming.
Doing a lot of zooming. So now for you, Tom, I mean, like a Saturday is like a whole day.
Yes, but what I've been able to do is move things to where they're actually videos and then discussion on Saturday. So it breaks down the all day kind of, because most people with kids, family, and everything at home aren't able to do full day. Right. Yeah.
Well, anyway, welcome again to the Theology Pugcast. My name is C.R. Wiley. I'm the senior pastor of the Presbyterian Church of Manchester in Manchester, Connecticut, and I've written a bunch of stuff. Tom, introduce yourself.
Tom Price, systematic theologian, Christian ethicist. I teach both at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a professor of European history at Central Connecticut State University and senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
And we see, Glenn, that we are in yet another beautiful setting with you. And I imagine you'll tell us about it in a minute. It's your show today, and I know what the subject is, and so does Tom, but we'll let you talk about it. We don't want to steal your thunder. But before we get to that, last time we had our show, we talked about our Indiegogo campaign, and that's been launched. And we have made good progress this past week. We are a quarter of the way to our goal of $4,000. And so we appreciate all the folks who have made pledges, and I know that you're breathlessly awaiting your pug glass or your pug t-shirt or both. Well, we've got those in the works, and hopefully we'll be able to get those out to you shortly after the campaign ends. The campaign goes for 60 days. I think we're on day, we've had a week, so I guess we're on day 54 or something like that, 53 yet to go. So since we're only a week in. But if you would like to help us out, we'd appreciate it. And you can find a link in the show notes on whatever the podcast platform you're listening to this on. Or you can go to YouTube, where we have the Theology Pugcast YouTube channel, or you can visit our Facebook page, the Theology Pugcast page on Facebook. Anyway, enough of that. So, Glenn, what are we talking about today?
Well, today we're going to look at a concept that has largely been lost in our culture, but I think is worth taking another look at, and that's chivalry. And in fact, that's why you are looking at a medieval city from southern France. This is Carcassonne. Carcassonne is actually goes back well before the Middle Ages. The foundations for a lot of the walls around the city date to the Visigothic period, late Roman period, but it's been built up ever since through the centuries. And it's the site of any number of medieval movies that were filmed here. So this is Carcassonne. And since we're doing chivalry, I thought a medieval site would be appropriate.
Great. So go ahead and let's jump in. What do you want to say to get us started, Glenn?
Okay, well, let's just take a look at chivalry as a concept, where it comes from. Chivalry originally simply was a word that meant cavalry. Comes from cheval, meaning horse. The chivalry were the horsemen, the cavalry, the knights in the early Middle Ages. From there, the term more or less shifts in meaning to the ethos and the values of that class, the knights and the nobles. And originally, this was really basically the martial virtues. You know, it's strength, it's courage, it's stamina, it's loyalty, it's self-sacrifice, all of those kinds of things that you want in a warrior, that you want in a soldier. And so originally, it was just, like I said, simply a term, actually not much different from the Roman word virtus.
Yeah, that's what came to mind. Yeah.
It refers to almost precisely the same things in its original use. As time goes on, however, two other influences start coming in that shape chivalry. One of them is the church. The idea, the ideals of the gospel, that you want to be to defend the poor, defend the helpless against the aggressor, those kinds of things. And then with that, there's a very strong Christian component that gets added into even the rituals that make you a knight. And then the other part that comes in somewhere around the 12th century in southern France, actually not too far from Carcassonne here, is the courtly love tradition. And that's going to start with Eleanor of Aquitaine, really, in her court. And that's going to add to it a particular devotion to women and upholding them and well, a whole range of other things, some of which are positive values and some of which are emphatically not. Courtly love tends to glorify adultery, for example, not a particularly good thing. But these three elements, the martial, the religious, and the courtly love tradition, come together to form the ideals that characterize medieval chivalry. Now, we do have another problem with chivalry, and that's the question. Now, historians are always arguing about things like this. There's a question of whether what we're dealing with in chivalry ever actually existed. So when you read the Arthurian romances, you see these epitomes of chivalry, but they were from an earlier era. They were back in this golden age when knights were really what knights should be, and they behaved properly as good Christian knights in courtly love tradition and all of that sort of thing. You read Mallory, you read all of the Arthurian romances, you read the other chivalric romances, they're always set in the past. So
this of course, this is amusing because I just watched Camelot with my daughter the other day, and then of course you've got Lancelot, c'est moi,
yes, c'est moi.
About how humble he is.
Yes.
It's me.
Had I been made the partner of Eve, we'd be in Eden still. Yeah. Yeah. So chivalry, actually, when in the literature of the period, chivalry is always this ideal from some golden age in the past. So it's a question how much it really existed. Probably the one example of someone that I could point to that almost matches the ideals, and I'm not going to go into this guy's history, but he's worth looking up, is a guy by the name of William the Marshal. William the Marshal was, I think, almost indisputably the greatest knight of medieval Europe. This is a man who never lost a tournament. When he was in his 60s, the young bucks around him were scared to death of him. I mean, he was just incredible, but he held the ideals very highly. He's about the only one I know.
So now William the Marshal, is this martial in terms of martial, arts, or is this martial in terms like an office?
The title of marshal means the guy who's in charge of the cavalry commander. So he was the Marshal of England under Henry II Plantagenet, under Richard, and under John.
Okay. So he's got some connections to some pretty significant kings. And
and despite the fact that he's from relatively low noble background himself, the guy was just so impressive. And so, to put William in perspective, Henry II asked William at one point to dissolve his oath to Henry II and instead swear an oath of loyalty to Henry's son, who was going to be the heir to the throne. Because he said, look, the young Henry needs a firm hand to help guide him along. Well, young Henry, it turned out, ended up revolting against Henry II. And William, because his oath was now to Henry Jr., William fought on the side of Henry Jr. against Henry II, even though he thought this was a terrible idea. When Henry Jr. died, Henry II took William back, even though he'd fought against him. He knew William, and he knew that William was just doing what William swore he would do. And if William swore loyalty back to Henry Sr., he was going to live by it.
Wow.
So because of that, William has been described as the epitome of chivalry and sort of the last and maybe the only real representative of it, because he was so strict in terms of following these ideals. Now, the historical stuff is really interesting, but the reason I brought it up has to do with something C.S. Lewis wrote, and there was a doodle that I sent around.
Yeah.
About this to you guys, which you will, I'm sure, put in the show notes, where C.S. Lewis was talking about the importance of chivalry for today. Essentially, what he said is, we need people who can operate on we need men who can operate on both ends of the spectrum. They have to be able to be fierce. They have to have, to use the old word, prowess. They've got to be able to fight and contend and hold their own and maintain all of the martial virtues that were at the foundation of what chivalry was, on the one hand. But on the other hand, when it isn't time to go to battle, they have to be gentle and courteous and respectful and humble and all of those kinds of things. And this weird bifurcation that chivalry sort of demanded is something that Lewis really thought was essential for our day and that had been utterly lost. You know, if you look at something like the Abolition of Man, where he talks about men without chests, seeing the loss of one or arguably both sides of the coin with chivalry, the balance in chivalry. So I thought that would be a worthwhile idea to explore. How exactly do we recover both sides of this? Because frankly, what I see are a lot of people who are timid and all of that sort of thing in places where they need to be strong, and loud and aggressive in places where they need to be soft.
That's an interesting inversion. I think I'm on board with that. I've seen the same thing. I can see you've got something you wanted to say, Tom.
No, I think it was the same as his latter point. It's that's the curious thing is the way these things have really gotten out of balance and if not flipped. and then as Lewis said, the thing that keeps them proportioned has been basically pulled out, removed, and therefore you have these extremes rather than you having a integrated human and man able to carry these out the right way in the right orders in relation to the right things. And so that's sort of what, and I think you see this especially in the way in which men trying to carry out being a man in society have lost that sort of roadmap, and you see the therapeutic, for example, try to come in, but it's not geared towards that. It's geared toward the emotional, strictly in the feeling realm, and it doesn't address any of that disintegration that I think Lewis was trying to recapture.
Right. One of the things I think is true is that paradoxically, when a man embodies chivalry in the way you described, Glenn, he's respected even today. But I think that the pedagogy of our society is unable to create that kind of man. So you've got this problem where as Tom notes, young men don't really know how to get from point A to point B, and they're not really sure it's okay to get there. They kind of feel like they need to be a pajama boy all the time, super sensitive, and supporting all the right causes and that kind of thing. And then if they ever have any sort of confrontation, they become kind of shrill, if you know what I mean.
Right.
And the flip side is when they naturally resist the pajama boy type and they want to take on something that is much more, aggressive, to show their bravado, they take on, the gangster, the rapper, the kind of the person who can navigate the city, the neighborhood, the hood, and so it doesn't.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So if you're a white guy, then you try to be like, the Godfather.
Yeah.
Black guy, then you try to be Ice-T.
Or you go the direction of the skinhead white supremacist, the worst of the heathen tradition,
right?
The worst of that, or you do something along those lines. The thing that I find interesting on this is that if you look at how they tell you to deal with bullies at school, in the old days, back when I was a kid. when you were going to deal with a bully, the way you did it is you punched him out. You can't do that now.
Yeah.
Which all that does is it actually, for people who are inclined to bully, they just sort of laugh it off and they keep coming. Or coming, they go online and get nasty there.
Yeah. And also what occurs is that it fosters a kind of dependency upon authority figures that I think is unhealthy. Mm. You really need to have competence on your feet in order to get along it or get through the world well. Know how to think, and conduct yourself in very, in difficult circumstances. So, over the years, I found myself in various situations, and one of the things that's saddened me or sort of alarmed me about many young people is their inability to deal with crisis. They more or less just they're like get the deer in the headlights kind of thing, and they're unable to sort of think their way through it. And I think partly because they've always had an authority figure to appeal to, when things get tough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a martial arts guy I know, who I will not name here, who says that violence isn't, how does he put it? It's something like violence isn't always the answer, but when it is, it's the only answer.
Right. That's true.
And that's a situation that we are sort of systematically trying to prevent people from ever needing to confront, which in an ideal world you would never have to, but we're not in an ideal world. We're in a fallen world. And sometimes violence happens, and sometimes it's really the only answer.
Well, this gets me thinking a little bit about William Blake. I just got William Blake's, illuminated books. So all of his illuminated books have been, reproduced in this really marvelous bound volume. But I'm thinking about that, the Songs of Innocence and Experience, the tiger.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So here we have the tiger, and Blake is sort of thinking aloud or wondering aloud, how could the same God who made the lamb make the tiger?
Yeah.
So how do we hold these things together even in ourselves? So, if we think about, we joked a little bit earlier about Lancelot, but Lancelot was celebrating what you just described, this ability that Lewis talks about, on the one hand, to kill you,
yeah,
and on the other hand, to raise you from death. If you remember in Camelot, the film, and the scene where he bests everybody at the tournament and actually kills a guy, and then prays over him, weeping for him to come back to life, and he does.
And it's interesting. I mean, following the Blake point, because Blake in the same writings, he has this fascinating way of taking these two things that kind of have become bifurcated and saying that if they were properly ordered, they could all be celebrated. So he has the famous one. He goes, dear mother, the church is cold, but the ale house is very warm. So if at the church they could give him some ale, the whole world would regale. He goes on this whole line. But it's a similar point. You have something that's separated from the virtues of godliness, becomes drunkenness, right?
Yeah.
But then you have separated from life and the celebration of creation, the church becomes cold. And it's very similar with these virtues and dispositions. You rip one off from the other, and they're not integrated the right way. You don't end up with things ordered the proper way, and therefore the imbalance creates something far worse. Right. Because of its having to make up for the lack of not being properly integrated.
Yeah,
I would argue that Blake has the wrong analogy. It's not the tiger and the lamb; it's the lion and the lamb.
Yeah.
Maybe he stayed away from lion for that very reason. I don't know.
But that's something we have to keep in mind. The lion and the lamb are integrated in Christ.
Well, yeah, that's a great point. And one of the things,
as Christians, we need to recognize that.
And I remember years ago, someone telling me that what women really want in a man is a killer who can cry.
So, and that brings up actually another point that I wanted to go to. On the one hand, we have an entire educational system and philosophy of raising kids that are pushing boys away from things that used to be considered essential, which is the ability to handle yourself physically on multiple levels, including defending yourself.
Right. Because
you want to fight, but because you don't want to fight. And so you need to be able to handle yourself so that the situation doesn't come up. We got a system that pushes us radically away from that on the one hand. So what happens? What are boys, young men, proverbially doing now? They're sitting on their computers playing first-person shooters.
Right. Yeah. Right.
There is something, now I want to pull this back to sort of metaphysical concepts. There's something about the Y chromosome. There's something about masculinity that I think naturally craves some sort of excitement, some sort of challenge, something that pushes beyond sort of the sort of soft everyday life and wants something more. And if they don't have it in their real life, they will look for it online. And they're going to look for it online in the form of video games and in the form of pornography.
Or, the more testosterone-driven guys will be thrill seekers who bungee jump off of bridges and stuff.
Right.
Now, all that stuff, I think in the past was sublimated in a way that it was redirected toward socially productive things.
Right.
So there's a reason why entrepreneurs are, in terms of, when we think about, well, for example, when we look at the Fortune 500 and we see who runs the Fortune 500, it's about 95% men. And there's a reason why this tends to happen, and that's because the guys who found the companies are men, and they're unlikely to want to just hand over the reins of a company that they founded just because it would look good to the social justice crowd. So there's a risk taking that sometimes is mocked. You've probably seen these memes. Why, memes that have, the punchline is, why men don't live as long as women. But for me, my point is the reason why women live so long is because of guys like that. In other words, if women didn't have those men protecting them, they'd be dead. Mm-hmm. Those are exactly the guys who go into burning buildings, who catch the bad guy, who charge when they're commanded to charge in battle, and have the physical wherewithal to actually win. So all that kind of stuff, in fact, I think that, when you think about in the past, that risk-taking sort of propensity that young men have was encouraged because civilization needed that. Go west, young man. We need you to do this. You're the best choice for the job. No one is as strong as you, as fast as you, can kill like you. What I'm getting at. Old men can't do it. Women can't do it. Children can't do it. You've got the job. Go do it. We need you to do it. No one's sending that message today because everything has been domesticated.
Okay. Now, think about the three aspects of chivalry I talked about before. The martial, the courtly love tradition, and the church. We have systematically downplayed the martial in the culture. We've got a cult of safety in society.
Tell me about it. If someone tells me to be safe one more time, I think I might kill somebody.
Yeah. So we're constant. We've got helicopter parents. They don't want their kids taking risks. All of these kinds of things. So risk taking is gone. That's sort of the prowess side of things. We don't want that. We have created a church culture that is...
Tell me about it.
Okay. Yeah. That again downplays what would be traditionally considered masculine virtues and things like that in favor of Jesus is my boyfriend songs.
And they, in fact, some of these guys actually mock traditional masculine traits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and you think about it by parallel or analogy. Analogy is the better word, not parallel. By analogy, we've done the same thing with domesticating God. I mean, right. We've basically, the vulnerable God, right? The Jesus, the vulnerable God, that, William Plaker's famous. I get what they're up to. They're trying to talk about how the power of God is so profound that even in Jesus' vulnerability as a human crucified.
But let's be honest. Let's be honest, Tom.
Yeah.
You were at Oxford. I was at Harvard. The people who promote this kind of stuff couldn't defend themselves even if they wanted to.
No. No. and to even think that they would have to defend themselves, and not even in maybe argument anymore. But yes, I mean, you've seen what contrast the moral attributes of God of a Jonathan Edwards or another time. To the therapeutic, papa. I mean, I was at a church once where the guy came out and he's just, hey, God, it's like, cool brother, I almost had one of those moments where, like in the New Testament where they kind of rip the garments. But I mean, it's like Stanley Hauerwas said when he visited one of the local Baptist seminaries for a debate, he goes, their chapel looks like my living room. It was that kind of thing. And I think, when God has become so casual and when you're talking about omnipotent, I mean, even the nominalists understood what omnipotence.
Well, getting this whole idea of, a proper regard for authority. I remember one time I was called in for jury duty in Boston, and some guy had, some judge who came in to sort of, to talk to us prospective jurors. I guess he'd watched too many episodes of Night Court. He had the jeans on underneath his robe. He was just like, hey, how you doing? He's very friendly. And, and here I am. I'm been called in for jury duty. I do not want to be there. The only reason I'm there is fear. That's it. And so I'm like, he says, call me Bob, Judge Bob. And I say, I thinking to myself, you know what, Judge Bob, if it was just you, I'd be out of here. But there's a bunch of guys behind you with guns and looking very, very intimidating that make your whole I'm just Bob routine ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? If police officers and people in authority just were like touchy-feely, our society would become, it would be taken over by, the mafiosos who would take it over. Anyway, enough of my routine. Back to you, Glenn.
Yeah. So anyway, the point is we have lost, if you consider this a court of three strands, we've lost the martial with no emphasis on that, no emphasis on prowess, replace that with safety. Our understanding of God and God's demands on us, which is the essence of what the Christian contribution to chivalry is. It is that God places demands on us that we need to live up to. And those demands mean that we're going to use our prowess, we're going to use our physical abilities, we're going to use all of those things for the defense of the weak, for the defense of the faith. We have a very undemanding faith.
Yeah, and contrast that with, say, an Athanasius or a Saint Nicholas would punch an Arian in the face.
Yeah, one of my favorite memes is an icon of Saint Nicholas that says, "I've come to bring presents and to punch heretics, and I just ran out of presents."
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, go on, because I'm about to move to women as the next one.
Okay, well, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think though, we've talked about sort of the social ethos, or the sort of the ethos of our culture right now, which does not encourage the martial. But I also think that this other side is not even recognized in our current culture as either. What I see with regard to gentleness, meekness, service, these sort of dimensions, this sort of other side of chivalry. What's replaced it is a kind of mawkishness, a kind of emotivism, niceness. Well, we've had an episode on niceness.
Yeah.
But there's this smoothness, this sort of, not wanting to cause a ripple, but also a kind of emotivism that I think is unhealthy.
Yeah. And another place, I'm going to move on, the other place where that unhealthy emotivism or unhealthy emotion more generally is found is, once again, the entire courtly love tradition. Now, like I said, there were negatives about the courtly love tradition. It only applies to the upper classes and so on. There's a whole bunch of things we could get into there. But at the very least, it was built around the concept that women are there to be respected. You quote, love and you serve your lady. You serve women. And they're to be protected, they're to be respected. That has been replaced by pornography, which is as misogynistic an industry as exists. It's built around exploitation of women, it's built around objectification of women, and increasingly it's built around violence against women. So in a lot of ways, we have taken all of the things of chivalry, however much we may make fun of it, and there are things about chivalry that deserve at least a little bit of ridicule. But however much that may be, we've taken every aspect of it and completely gutted it in our culture. We've got a culture that is really the anti-chivalric culture. And the question that really comes to my mind then is this really the world you want to live in? And I grew up in the 70s when women would yell at you for holding the door for them. I mean, I literally had that happen to me. I still hold doors for people, but do you really want a world in which all of those ideals are gone? In which case, what you are really doing is setting up the world to turn it over to the barbarians. Or actually, in many cases, I would argue you're inviting the barbarians in.
Yeah. So by inviting the barbarians in, what I'm hearing you say is we're losing sort of the internal restraints, because I think that one of the things that chivalry presupposes is that there is an unequal distribution of certain goods. For example, it's not simply that women are served by knights, but the knights serve justice for all, including those who are, poor or in the lower classes, peasants, whatever. If we're in the medieval world,
and it's ideal,
right? And it's ideal. And that's what ideals are. I mean, ideals. We have to, ideals are to be striven for. It's easy to identify lapses because we all fall short, right? But But just because we fall short doesn't mean the ideal is absurd or worthless. In fact, that may actually imply that it's even more important to pursue.
Right.
But I guess this idea, like today we hear a lot about privilege and how this is like this awful thing. Nevertheless, there seems to be an implicit sort of message to those of us who are privileged that we should look after those in the interest of those who are not, which I think is good. So now, to be absolutely real, let's just be real. Okay, so I am an American, which automatically puts me into a very exclusive club in the sort of the total population of the world. And I'm part of the Western tradition, which has given the world science. It's given the world great literature. It's given the world great art. I mean, I am part of this marvelous patrimony. So I enjoy many things that people in other parts of the world don't enjoy. Now, if I had a thoroughly egalitarian sort of mindset, which said, "Oh, it's wrong it's just by prima facie wrong to have anything when somebody else doesn't have it," I would just live with perpetual guilt, which is what most of these people seem to do.
Yeah,
I believe that
they do.
Yeah, I believe though that these things are, and then you add on to that, the fact I'm a man and so forth, and I've got some resources and I own property and da 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 da. I'm in probably the top 10% in terms of, resources, ability, personal sort of presence, all these different things in the entire world population. So I can pretend that these things aren't true, or I can decide to live in a chivalrous way and sense that, okay, in other words, I can never get away from this. I can't deny this. I can't pretend that I was, like Steve Martin. I was born up, the line I'm getting, from his film, The Jerk. I was born a poor black child. I can't pretend that ever, even though I've had some hardship in my life. But I can never pretend that. So what should I do? I should take this stuff and put it into the service of the human race, right?
Yeah, I've always argued
the chivalrous thing to do.
Right. Yeah, I've always argued. Well, or it's the Spider-Man thing: with great power comes great responsibility. I mean,
Right.
This concept has been sort of around forever in different forms. And you're right. I don't think that there's anything wrong with privilege. Okay, it's a fact of life in a world where inequality exists.
And there's a term rather than move it to the to allow a certain cultural interpretation and category. But there was a term once upon a time that Christians had, and it was used properly rather than materialistically, and it was called blessing.
Yeah, right.
We prayed, the people of our spiritual tradition as Christians, from the patriarchs to today, using patriarchs wisely, prayed, "Bless me, Lord," to be blessed, to have God's favor sit on them. And that favor always had huge things that both had responsibilities, but also allowed one to flourish in ways that it wasn't merely a blessing. There was never a blessing for myself. It was a lineage. It was a people. It was the community of faith. It was the church. So the blessing, therefore the world through the church. So, for God to bless a people, Israel, was to bless all the nations, to bless them with Jesus Christ, the Messiah, becomes a blessing into the nations. I mean, when you convert that into such a perverse category of privileges, though, and I get, I mean, the scripture you rich people, don't leave the poor people out. You don't start eating before everyone else. I get that argument, but that's a very different argument than this new one, that if you have any blessing more than someone else, somehow there has been input into that, some injustice.
Right. Yeah. And, my argument has always been, yeah, you know what? There are a lot of privileges that we have. And the solution to that is not to worry about the privileges per se, it's to extend them. To extend those privileges to those who don't currently have them. It's exactly the concept you're talking about with blessing, that when you're blessed, you are blessed to be a blessing. When you are privileged to extend privilege to others, to work for a more just world. And that, the focus, there's a perverse sort of focus in this whole thing on envy. Envy is the flip side of pride. Pride is the desire to force yourself ahead of all others. Envy is the desire to tear down anyone who's in front of you. And the focus on privilege, it seems to me, in our current culture, is really envy. It's really about tearing down anyone who is perceived as being ahead. Proper way to achieve a better society is not to tear down the people who are ahead, it's to raise up the people who are behind.
Yeah. Well, and two, I think we need to be realistic about what's achievable.
Sure.
So
we're in a fallen world.
Well, not just that, but I mean, just that the God has unequally distributed certain goods. So, for example, some people are always going to be stronger than other people.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Some people are going to be smarter than other people. Some people are going to be born into families that have connections. Some people are going to be born into families that have a great deal of artistic talent. There are going to be these inequities. And we can either construe those inequities as being something to sort of see as heinous, or we can see them as a means by which God has made us depend on each other. So that, okay, you have this, Glenn, you have this, Tom, I have this. We need each other. We can't just sort of pretend that we're completely worlds unto ourselves.
Yeah.
We all have gifts. And there are going to be people within this uneven distribution who have gifts that are more, I guess, fitted for leadership. So, for example, if a person may have, let's say a person has great physical strength, but doesn't know what to do with it. and there's somebody who comes along and says, I've got something for you to do.
Yeah.
I need your help because I'm not, well, for one thing, I'm physically not strong enough to do what you can do. But secondly, I've got other things to think about, and I only have so much time in the day, and I need this done. I'll pay you for it. I'll pay you a just wage or whatever, but I want you to do this for me, and I need to direct you in the process. This, by the way, is what, Aristotle gets a lot of heat for talking about natural slaves. What he meant by that is that there are some people who do not possess enough intelligence to know how to direct their efforts intelligently. Now, that could be a pedagogical problem. That could be it could be a natural thing. Just some people, for some reason, just don't have certain intellectual gifts. Now, within the framework that Aristotle presents, in this, of course, in the politics and the ethics, the same thing applies in a world without slaves. It applies in a place where people sell their labor to other people. In other words, there are some people who think and plan, and they need people to do things according to plan. And there are other people who don't want to plan, who don't want to think. They just want to show up and get there and do the work and go home and do what they want to do. So you get my point. There's always going to be
so in some case you have sort of an architect, and then you have the painter who comes in and paints the rooms for the architect. Very different goals, aims, and everything else, and definitely there's different rewards for each kind of contribution, and that can, and I think maybe that's where these equalitarians or egalitarians. They may think that certain things that are valued more highly shouldn't be valued so highly, or the other way around. Things that have been culturally considered of lower value are not rewarded the same way. So they kind of step into, I think, that kind of that framework. But they don't, again, those kind of questions still are working from the assumption that one can flatten certain kinds of goods and the values placed on those goods in such a way that there is no way to differentiate them. And it's simply not even conceivable, much less possible. I mean, there's going to be a radically different set of valuation placed on someone who can create the architectural structure of Notre Dame or something else than the person is going to lay the brick for it. It's going to be like that. And it should be like that.
Having said that, one of my favorite cathedrals in Europe is the cathedral in Antwerp. It's a beautiful cathedral in and of itself, but the thing that I am most taken with is on the west facade to the south side. There is a monument to the people who built it, to the stonemasons and the mathematician, architect types and things like that, because we have no idea who this was in most cases, even the architects. There's a place for a monument to those people.
Yeah.
But having said that, you're right. They would never have been able to conceive of the overall design of the cathedral and sort of the macro picture of what's going on.
And they're you're right.
Skill.
That's right. They're indispensable to it in the value of the dignity of their work. That's not the question.
Right.
And that someone's better than someone else. Christianity does away with that. What we're talking about is different valuations of the kind of contribution to something. All is needed, all contributes. And yet that doesn't mean every single thing, every sort of gift is of the same blessing. I mean, one can think of it from a different set of the world. There are people who make some of the most stunning instruments out of handcrafted wood, selected wood. That's an art in and of itself. They may not be able to play a lick or two or a chord on the guitar, but they can make one that somebody who does have the gift is able to lift that thing into almost another world of aesthetics. And so you need both, and both have their own place. But the one making it and may not be able to play something, and the one who's able to play it but cannot make anything, they're completely dependent on each other. And their gifts flourish in a relationship to each other, but they're different gifts, and there's going to be a different value. No one goes to a concert, or only a few people. Well, maybe there's a few guitarists out there, but who says, that great guitarist, the whole time they're just focusing on the person who made that guitar. Now, there are good guitars, and you think, wow, that guitar sounds great, the whole concert. But most of the time, you're thinking about the person who plays it well. That's a different valuation than the guy who made the guitar. Doesn't mean they're less important, has less dignity, but the emphasis is very different. Nobody's buying a CD because somebody strictly is playing, a Martin or, a custom-made acoustic. Maybe that adds the difference to their sound, but the reason is that person can play. They play beautifully.
But I would assume, though, Tom, that the person who most appreciates the artisan is the guy who's playing the guitar.
Well, that's right. That's right. And maybe they're the one the whole time saying, I could never have done this without the one who did this.
Right.
And so the appreciation there and the respect for the gift is there. That's why you often see people who build very beautiful building on the ground close friends with the people who are digging the foundations.
Yes. Yeah, I think that sometimes there are surprising friendships for people who are sort of outside of a world, who look in on it, who might not have any ability to sort of understand the dynamic that goes on, in the sense that, say, a great musician understands that part of his greatness has to do with the ability to play a great instrument.
That's right.
No one who's just listening to music has an ability to discern a mediocre instrument from a good instrument from a great instrument.
Yep. Yes, that's right. And it does make a difference to the musician. There is a world of difference between a very bad instrument and a well-constructed. And it does make a lot of the difference in the performance of the performer. So, I mean, this is what I'm saying, is where different blessings and what you would oftentimes think of is, if you were talking of cultural praise or recognition, are very different. I mean, nobody's going to buy, again, there's probably not, other than buying the instrument or being granted the instrument, there's probably not a lot of funds going from the great performer CD sales to the person who made it. So, yeah, you can charge a lot for the instrument, and you may get a lot of people buying the instrument because X plays it, or Clapton plays it or whatever. But on the other hand, it's disproportionate. Is that an injustice? That's, I think, where these people go.
Yeah, I think that's what undermines the value that we once placed on chivalry. The chivalrous person understands that the reason I possess these gifts is so that I can serve other people. It's not merely to sort of present myself as better than them or lord it over them. But it doesn't. But chivalry accepts the gift. It doesn't pretend.
Yeah.
You've come across these. I'm just like you. No, you're not. You're not just like the rest of us. You really do have certain things going for you that other people don't have. So don't be embarrassed by that.
That's right.
The problem. That's the problem with egalitarianism. It plays these stupid games.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm just like, no, you're not. There are some people who have gifts that are greater than other people, and let's just accept it. Now, I think there are a couple of areas where we don't appear to have as much difficulty accepting the inequities. I think one is music. I think the other is sport.
Yeah,
music and sport tend to be the places where we're willing to accept. Okay, that guy really can do things I can never do.
Yeah. And again, no one wants to close off the biblical fact that there are injustices. There are things that do not give people their due for a lot of reasons. Maybe someone hates women, or they hate people of a particular race, or they don't think they're equal, and those are sin. But those things are not answered by punishing blessing and those that have been blessed, because what you're doing is actually shutting the door on the very way in which that integrated whole is contributing to everyone's flourishing in the long run. It's your gift, and it's all the gifts around me that help. It's all those handcrafting instrument makers that make my guitar playing well, right? So in that sense, for someone with full character, chivalry for that matter, someone who recognizes that responsibly, utilizes their gift to be a great performer in honor of all of those who have laid the foundation for them, and in some senses lifted their work and their craftsmanship to a level at which others are benefited, and you can also see the full display of the gift that their craftsmanship has provided by someone performing and using it well. So it's all connected.
Yeah, and I am not a craftsman by any stretch of the imagination, but I could imagine that the great luthier who makes this stunning guitar finds his greatest satisfaction in placing that guitar in the hands of a musician who can really bring out everything that's in it.
And what is
Yeah, and so they end up actually collaborating in a sense and mutually finding joy in each other's work.
Yeah.
This kind of reminds me in a weird way of Howard Finster. Now, Howard Finster was a Baptist preacher who was a funky dude. He was a folk artist. I collect his work. And Paradise Garden, all that.
His cotton cloud things are amazing.
But some of his works today go for tens of thousands of dollars, and I suspect that there'll be a day when they're going for hundreds of thousands. I think the thing that depresses their value is there's so much of it. He produced so much stuff.
Yeah.
But what sort of put him in the spotlight was the fact that internationally celebrated rock bands took an interest in him.
REM. Was it REM out of Georgia? Yeah.
REM and Talking Heads and a bunch of other bands. They would take pilgrimages to Paradise Garden where Howard Finster did his thing.
Interesting.
And the thing about it is they were able to see because they were artists.
Yeah.
They could see something in his work that they could identify with and they liked.
Interesting.
And Howard Finster was old-time preacher. He would tell them they were going to hell and they needed all this kind of stuff. And in fact, his work was put on display at the Met in New York. And he gave them a hellfire brimstone message when he was given an opportunity to speak. But anyway, but when you see his stuff, now there are some folks who look at it, these are the Philistines, who look at it and say, oh, that's just craziness. That's just insane. People who have a sense of sort of genius who say that crazy old Georgia preacher had something. He had something that is rare. And so then they became his advocates. In a strange way. All these very sophisticated, highly educated, well-heeled people took this poor Baptist preacher and made him a phenomenon.
And he was an interesting Baptist preacher because he was able to juxtapose that Baptist preacherly kind of Southern world. And he would have, if I remember right, he had things like with Elvis and some other figures. So you can see how so you can see how he like pulled in these kind of these people that otherwise were very separated, and their attention would be drawn to this, and he was able to kind of to fit right into that kind of odd.
Did you ever see his illustrated Cadillac?
I don't know if I have.
It was an actual Cadillac, and he had painted all these figures on it. And so but that's it. So you needed to have a sense of kind of. You had to be a genuine creative. See, in this very primitive man. I mean, he was unschooled. Never been to art school, but he just had it. There was something about his angle of vision. That other artists would say, that guy is got it. That's something I want to connect to. In fact, I put a bid in on a piece by Robert Finster, or Howard Finster, I should say, Howard Finster, that had been owned by Robin Williams. Think about that. So Robin Williams, think about that. Super wealthy. He had in his home a Howard Finster. And you know what a Howard Finster is. It's got scripture all over it. It's telling you that you're going to hell if you don't go to
apocalyptic imagery.
But I think though that when you're REM or you're the Talking Heads and you see a Howard Finster, you can say, you know what, a lot of these people out there who are in our audience don't understand what true genius is. And we're going to help you see where you would overlook.
And this is another show, and I know we went down a lot of trails like we always do, but I think REM and some of these other roots figures the more you tap into roots of anything, the more you start to get into the spiritual foundations, and they understand that Howard Finster and the kind of folk music that they were tapping into share a very common spiritual root, that kind of world. So REM may not be pursuing those ends, but the roots of their folkish kind of disposition in Georgia and in that world grew out of those spiritual traditions that Finster's art grew out of. They did not grow out of, something else. So there's a weird connectedness, and I think this is the stuff that Lewis and other figures people were able to tap into, is that there's this deep connectedness in the roots, the cultural roots and the spiritual foundations, especially the Christian, the differing kind of Christian impact of the early roots of America, American culture, that end up in these weird kind of mixes. But people like that have an antenna for, which a lot of people, even theologically attuned, don't realize is going on.
Well, and getting back to Glenn's, subject.
I was wondering how we got.
That's right. Sorry.
I think that when REM and the Talking Heads saw Howard Finster, they did something chivalrous. What do you think about my weird idea there, Glenn? Do you see them in the sense that here they are, these world-renowned rock stars? They see Howard Finster and they say, I'm gonna become that guy's advocate, or I'm gonna point to him and say there's something valuable here. Is that chivalrous?
It's kind of an odd use of the word chivalry, but I think it fits the spirit of it. It's a recognition that, this guy that nobody else was really paying a heck of a lot of attention to, except some folk art collectors, maybe, who was completely on the margins of polite society, if even on the margins.
That's right, even on the planet.
that they were recognizing in him, there's a degree of humility that's involved in that. That says that, this is a guy that most people don't recognize, but the fact is that there's genius here.
Yeah. And even most from the Baptist world won't recognize,
Right. Yeah.
There's a kind of chivalry involved in that as well. I mean, again, if you think of it as the two poles, the right-hand side is sort of the martial, and the left-hand side is the humble, service-oriented, that sort of thing. It really does kind of land on that other side where it is, recognizing and acknowledging and paying tribute to someone that is would otherwise largely be ignored. That actually deserves it.
And it's interesting because it's somebody who like both of you, we both have a foot in the academic scene some ways, and in just it being theological and Christian, we have our feet in worlds that are in many ways what the world doesn't see much of the relevant value for. So you could almost use it by analogy of Finster's work. I mean, what we're dealing with all of us and kind of what we would say is kind of Christianity with integrity is non-utilitarian, like good art. And so the aesthetic value is very underappreciated. The antenna for it is only appreciated by certain kinds of spiritually disposed people. And so we do suffer, there is a certain suffering for a commitment to that, because the world doesn't, especially a world that is pragmatic and geared towards a certain product for a certain kind of human flourishing. When it doesn't answer that immediately the way the world defines it, it therefore is undervalued, underpaid, and underappreciated, right? So whatever other cultural capital you may have, that aspect of what we do doesn't have it. And yet on the other side, we have a set of riches tied to that can be found nowhere else. I always tell my students in theology is, what is it about Christianity that it's only Christianity that has? When you tap that, you finally realize something that no one else can wrap up and sell. You find out what we have, the pearl of great price that no one else has. And then you can start to build everything around it. I said, although what's at the heart of that is the world's rejection of it in terms of it as value. even though it's the most valuable, it's the pearl of great price. People see it, they'll give up everything for. If you wrap it in the world's kind of value terms, it's the most rejected thing, right? It's right. And so what happens here is the valuation, like when we talk of chivalry, you're cultivating all these dispositions that on the one hand are valued in relationship to that pearl of great price and those who live and are committed to it, and they understand it. But then in a world that has rejected the pearl of great price, those things become conflictual and problematic. And so that what appears to be chivalry now appears to be something that is in conflict with the values of the age. And so you almost come to an either or position. And so this kind of place at which, you raise a child to be chivalrous, but he or she goes to school with people who are not, dates someone who isn't, or hasn't been even cultivated in a church committed to that. What you begin to see is some of the things I think that I think, the church doesn't know how to digest. How do we take the good things that Lewis is saying and what you're talking about and cultivate community in such a way that not only recognizes that this is a value and this is a good and this balances things, but also what values we have to cultivate to allow people to live in the world with it and develop relationships with it in a world that rejects it.
Well, I think the thing that, and to tie into what you're saying, Tom, the thing that I see in chivalry is the recognition of the chivalrous man, okay, because it was a masculine virtue, is that there are some things that are undervalued in the world. Mm-hmm. And prowess, martial prowess, I don't know if there's ever been a culture that undervalued it or failed to recognize its value. Every culture, every state knows that this is important. Maybe we're the first to entertain the possibility that it's not, which is a really weird thing. But
although you'll notice that in our culture, the Navy SEALs, for example, are recognized as people that are sort of set apart.
Right. That's exactly right.
Now, you recognize the elites.
So, but now what I was getting at with my Finster illustration was the idea that the celebrated, the REMs, the talking heads of the world, can be the spokesman for the undervalued, can say, so let's think about women. Let's think about, okay, here I am, I'm a knight. Mm-hmm. Everybody knows how great I am.
The nightly outfit gives it away.
Let me tell you about my lady who's undervalued. She is worthy of your regard. And I'm going to show you that she is by demonstrating my regard for her. So I'm going to give you an example. And, I think when it's done right, it's not a show. It's an actual confession that I couldn't be what I am without her, right? So it's a way for the one who has been. So I would argue, there are people who say chivalry is dead. I would say no, it's not. Wherever there is someone who is recognized by society at large as being important, that person has an opportunity to exercise chivalry, to recognize other people like the Howard Finsters of the world who have not been recognized and say, come up here with me. I think that you're great. There's something about what you've done that's really great. And these other people here, these Philistines, they don't know. I know. like the musician with the guitar maker.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting from the theological world. I'm not a big fan of his theology, Wolfhart Pannenberg, the famous German theologian. But what is interesting is every single conference, and I saw him when I was in Oxford, he did an actual presentation. He was in his 80s, so he was still flying around doing these. But his wife was right beside him. And a friend of mine was writing a dissertation on Pannenberg and would fly to visit Pannenberg. And when he came back, he said, the first thing you do before you meet with Pannenberg is you meet with his wife. And he goes, and the second thing is she has to read your work on him before she even recommends whether you should meet with him or not. She had read every single thing written on Pannenberg that was known. And she was, I'm not saying every wife has to do that, but what I'm saying is this is an interesting way in which his gift and his theological contribution would never have been what it was had his wife not had that same commitment to what he did. And yet there was no Pannenberg without her. But on the other hand, it was vice versa. There was no her without the Pannenberg. And here you have this thing that didn't have to become competitive. It was complete with all the difference in that kind of union that was their marriage and the calling as well.
All right. Well, we've gotten to the point where we should probably wrap things up. I think we're past an hour or more. Glenn, is there anything you want to say? Again, as normal, we've kind of taken your theme and just taken it to weird places.
That's kind of an understatement. I'd like to just sort of go back briefly to those three themes. Sort of the issue of prowess. Capability, in terms of, originally martial prowess, but other sorts of prowess, I think we can add to it. I don't know any guy in particular, who wants to be incompetent in their area of work. Nobody really wants to. That's a fundamental element of chivalry, but it also involves, like I said, I would argue more broadly skill in other areas as well, physical ability, all of those kinds of things. I think that's really important to most males. The second area is the courtly love tradition, that we need to recover a proper kind of respect for women. That, again, I think the absolute antithesis of it is the pornographication of our culture. It is the antithesis of what the courtly love tradition and proper respect for women ought to be. And then the third one is the one that ties everything together, and that's a recovery of a holistic gospel that recognizes that when we say, crown him Lord of all, Jesus is Lord of all, there's nothing that's not included in all. And so that in all of our endeavors as men, in all of our endeavors in our relationships with women, in all of the battles that we choose to fight and the ones that we refrain from, in all of our dealings with people in utter courtesy and respect, all of these things, we're doing it as a reflection of the one who deserves our complete and total fealty. So it seems to me that these themes from chivalry are things that would be incredibly valuable to recover in our cultural moment, because they speak to a lot of the fundamental issues that men in our society are facing, and particularly Christian men.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. Thank you, Glenn, for introducing the theme of chivalry. Anyway, anything you want to say as we conclude, Tom?
No, I think the emphasis on retrieving, in retrieval of a lot of these historic lost riches, has been our theme anyway. And this is another area that we need to explore, and really helps carve the path forward to what it means to embody the faith and the richness of our createdness as men in the world.
Well, that's a great thought, and I don't have anything to add. So thanks a lot for listening to the Theology Pugcast, and we hope to have you back with us next week. Bye-bye.
Bye now.